The crisp autumn air carried a faint chill as Officer Todd Harding adjusted his uniform, the badge gleaming under the morning sun. Harding, a veteran police officer in a small southern town, prided himself on his strict enforcement of the law. For him, there were no exceptions, and in his mind, he believed he was upholding justice. But beneath the surface, there was a darker truth, a bias he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. The day had started like any other. Harding sat in his patrol car sipping coffee, scanning for any signs of trouble. When a sleek black sedan rolled through a stop sign at a quiet intersection, he flipped on his lights and pulled it over without hesitation. As he approached the car, his stride was confident, almost cocky, with the weight of authority resting heavily on his shoulders. Behind the wheel sat a woman in her mid-30s, dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit. Her posture was poised, and she exuded a calm confidence that immediately caught Harding off guard. Her name was Angela Monroe. She handed over her license and registration with steady hands, her warm brown eyes meeting his cold, scrutinizing gaze. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Harding asked, his tone clipped. Angela nodded politely. "Yes, officer. I believe I might have rolled through that stop sign." Her honesty seemed to annoy him. Harding's mind raced, searching for something more to assert his authority. He noticed the out-of-state plates on her car and narrowed his eyes. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "No, I'm here on business," Angela replied, keeping her tone respectful yet firm. Harding didn't like her calm demeanor. To him, it felt like a challenge, though Angela had done nothing wrong beyond the minor traffic violation. His tone grew sharper as he questioned her further, his words laced with unnecessary hostility. He asked where she was staying, why she was in town, and even made a veiled comment about her car being a bit fancy for this area. Angela's patience was steady, but internally she felt the familiar sting of discrimination. She dealt with people like Harding before, men who let their biases dictate their actions. Still, she remained composed, knowing that losing her temper wouldn't help the situation. Harding, however, seemed determined to escalate. When Angela questioned why he needed such detailed information, his face hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. Angela hesitated, taken aback by the unnecessary escalation. "Is that really necessary, officer? I've been cooperative." "It wasn't a request," Harding snapped. Reluctantly, Angela stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. Harding began searching her car, rummaging through her belongings without explanation. Passers-by slowed their cars to watch, and Angela felt the weight of their stares. "Is this really about a stop sign?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. Harding ignored her, continuing his search until he found nothing incriminating. Frustrated, he decided to arrest her for what he called resisting an officer's investigation. Angela was handcuffed, her wrists aching as the cold metal bit into her skin. She was placed in the back of the patrol car, her dignity bruised but not broken. At the station, Angela remained calm, even as Harding processed her paperwork with a smug grin. He thought he'd won, that he'd put her in her place. But Angela knew something he didn't, something that would change the course of both their lives. The following week, Harding walked into the courthouse with the same air of authority he carried everywhere. He was confident this case would be routine, another day of enforcing what he saw as justice. But when he stepped into the courtroom and saw the judge seated at the bench, his confidence faltered. There, in a black robe with a commanding presence, sat Angela Monroe. She was no longer the woman he had pulled over and humiliated on the side of the road. She was Judge Monroe, presiding over his case. Harding's jaw tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, fear. Angela's calm gaze met his, and though her expression was professional, there was no mistaking the quiet strength behind it. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for her to speak, and when she finally did, her words carried a weight that Harding couldn't ignore. "Officer Harding," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "you are here today because of your actions. Let's proceed." The story was far from over, but one thing was clear. The tables had turned. Officer Todd Harding couldn't shake the cold weight settling in his chest as Judge Angela Monroe's voice echoed through the courtroom. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had walked into the courthouse that morning expecting another routine day, another simple case. Instead, he was now standing before the very woman he had arrested a week prior, only now she held all the authority. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, a quiet tension filling the air like a storm about to break. Angela's gaze remained steady, unyielding, as she addressed the courtroom. Her demeanor was polished, professional, and carried the quiet power of someone who had spent her life navigating spaces where she wasn't always welcome. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Angela had known early on that the world was unfair, especially for people who looked like her. But instead of letting it embitter her, she used it as fuel. She worked tirelessly, earning scholarships and degrees that paved her way to law school and eventually to the bench. The road had been anything but easy, and Angela had encountered her fair share of people like Harding, men who assumed authority gave them the right to treat others as lesser. She had learned to maintain her composure, knowing that losing control or showing anger could be weaponized against her. But now, facing him from the judge's bench, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her. This was about accountability, about ensuring that people like Harding understood that they couldn't abuse their power without consequences. As the proceedings began, Harding's lawyer attempted to paint him as a dedicated officer with years of service, someone who had acted within the bounds of his duty. Harding, for his part, sat stiffly, his usual confidence replaced by a simmering unease. He avoided looking at Angela, his focus fixed on the table in front of him. Angela listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She had reviewed the case file thoroughly before stepping into the courtroom. It was all there: the unnecessary escalation during the traffic stop, the baseless arrest, the lack of evidence to justify his actions. She knew this was about more than just a single incident. It was a pattern, one that she had seen repeated in countless cases throughout her career. Meanwhile, Harding's mind raced. He replayed the events of that day over and over, trying to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong. But deep down, he felt the cracks in his justification. Angela's calm, unwavering presence during the traffic stop had unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just her confidence. It was the way she carried herself, as though she knew something he didn't. That feeling had lingered gnawing at him, and now it was clear why. The courtroom grew quiet as Angela spoke again, her voice measured but firm. "Officer Harding, the purpose of this hearing is to determine whether your actions were consistent with the law and the ethical standards expected of someone in your position. This is not a trial of your character, but an examination of your conduct." Her words were precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Harding felt his palms grow clammy, the weight of her authority pressing down on him. He had faced disciplinary hearings before, but this was different. This wasn't just about his badge or his career. It was about the growing realization that his actions had consequences, ones he could no longer ignore. Angela's thoughts briefly flickered back to her own experiences, moments when she had been treated unfairly or underestimated because of her race or gender. She thought about the countless stories she had heard from friends, colleagues, and strangers. Stories of bias, of humiliation, of being made to feel small. She had carried those stories with her, using them as a reminder of why she had chosen this path. And now, sitting on the bench, she felt the weight of those stories more than ever. As the hearing progressed, witness testimonies and evidence began to paint a clearer picture of what had happened during the traffic stop. Several bystanders had recorded parts of the incident, and their footage was now being presented as evidence. The videos showed Angela calmly complying with Harding's instructions, even as he grew increasingly hostile. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Angela had done nothing to provoke his behavior. Harding's lawyer tried to argue that his actions were justified under the circumstances, citing protocol and the need for officer discretion. But Angela wasn't swayed. She knew the difference between discretion and discrimination, between enforcing the law and abusing power. As the day wore on, Harding began to feel the walls closing in. The evidence was damning, and Angela's calm, methodical approach left little room for doubt. Still, he clung to his defense, refusing to acknowledge the underlying biases that had driven his actions. Admitting fault would mean confronting parts of himself he wasn't ready to face. For Angela, the hardest part was maintaining her composure. She couldn't let her personal feelings cloud her judgment, even as she felt the weight of everything Harding's actions represented. She knew this case would be watched closely, not just by the people in the courtroom, but by the community at large. It was a chance to send a message, to show that justice could prevail, even in the face of systemic inequities. As the hearing adjourned for the day, the tension in the courtroom lingered. Harding avoided meeting Angela's gaze as he left, his mind a whirlwind of anger, fear, and confusion. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless, and he didn't know how to handle it. Angela remained seated as the courtroom emptied, her thoughts heavy. She had done everything by the book, but she knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. This wasn't just about one case or one officer. It was about the larger fight for fairness and accountability, a fight that would continue long after this case was resolved. The story was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. Both Angela and Harding were on a collision course, their lives intertwined in ways neither of them could have anticipated. And as the sun set on the courthouse, the question lingered. When the truth was finally laid bare, who would emerge changed, and at what cost? As the days passed, the case surrounding Officer Todd Harding and Judge Angela Monroe became the talk of the town. It wasn't just another courtroom drama, it was a flashpoint for deeper issues that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Whispers spread in coffee shops, on front porches, and through the local media. Some saw Harding as a man caught in an unfortunate situation, a scapegoat for larger societal problems. Others viewed him as a symbol of unchecked power, someone who had finally been forced to answer for his actions. Angela, meanwhile, was hailed by many as a beacon of justice, though some questioned whether she'd remain impartial given her personal connection to the case. Behind the scenes, Angela was grappling with the weight of it all. She had always prided herself on her ability to separate her emotions from her work, but this case was testing her resolve. At night, she found herself replaying the events of that traffic stop in her mind, a calm exterior hiding the anger and frustration she felt. She couldn't ignore the irony of the situation, how a man who had sought to humiliate her was now at her mercy. But Angela knew that this wasn't about revenge. It was about integrity, about showing that justice could rise above personal grievances. Meanwhile, Harding's life was unraveling. The confidence he once carried was replaced with an uneasy tension that followed him everywhere. At the station, his colleagues kept their distance, unsure of how to approach him. Harding's reputation had always been that of a no-nonsense officer, someone who didn't back down. But now even his closest allies were questioning his judgment. Late at night, Harding would sit alone in his small apartment, a bottle of beer in hand, as doubts crept in. He thought about his years on the force, the arrests he'd made, and the countless interactions he'd had with people from all walks of life. Was it possible that he had been blind to his own biases? The thought made him uncomfortable, but he pushed it aside, clinging to the belief that he had only been doing his job. Adding to the tension was the appearance of a new player in the drama, a local journalist named Rachel Perez. Rachel had a knack for uncovering the truth, and she was determined to dig deeper into this case. She began interviewing witnesses, gathering footage, and piecing together a narrative that went beyond the courtroom. Through her investigation, Rachel uncovered a troubling pattern in Harding's record. Over the years, there had been multiple complaints against him for excessive force and discriminatory behavior, but none had resulted in disciplinary action. Rachel knew this information could turn the tide of public opinion, but she also understood the risks. Exposing the truth meant challenging a deeply ingrained system, one that wasn't eager to change. As Rachel's articles began to circulate, Harding found himself under even greater scrutiny. The media painted him as a symbol of systemic issues within law enforcement, and the pressure was mounting. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that called for accountability and justice. Some of Harding's supporters also showed up, arguing that he was being unfairly vilified. The atmosphere was charged, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. Amid the chaos, Angela received an unexpected visitor at her chambers, her younger brother, Marcus. Marcus had always been her biggest supporter, but he was also fiercely protective of her. He had seen firsthand the challenges Angela had faced to get where she was, and he wasn't shy about speaking his mind. "You don't owe that man anything," Marcus said, his voice firm. "He tried to humiliate you, Angela. You don't have to go easy on him." Angela looked at her brother, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about going easy on him," she replied. "It's about doing what's right. If I let my personal feelings dictate my decisions, then I'm no better than him." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I get that, but you're human. You've got every right to feel angry, to feel hurt. Just don't let the system use you to clean up its mess, and then leave you to deal with the fallout." Angela nodded, appreciating her brother's concern. He wasn't wrong. The system was flawed, and one case wouldn't fix it. But she also knew that every step toward accountability mattered, no matter how small. As the hearing continued, new evidence came to light. Rachel's investigation revealed that Harding's behavior during Angela's traffic stop wasn't an isolated incident. Testimonies from other individuals, many of them people of color, painted a troubling picture of an officer who often let his biases influence his actions. Harding's lawyer fought to discredit the witnesses, but the damage was done. The courtroom grew tense as each testimony added another layer to the case. For Harding, the revelations were like a punch to the gut. He had always seen himself as a good cop, someone who enforced the law without prejudice. But now he was being forced to confront a version of himself that he didn't recognize, or maybe one he had been unwilling to see. The thought was almost unbearable, and it left him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. Angela, too, was deeply affected by the testimonies. She saw the pain in the witnesses' faces, the frustration in their voices. It was a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. But it was also a stark reminder of how far there was to go. Outside the courthouse, tensions continued to rise. The protests grew larger, drawing attention from national media. Some saw the case as a pivotal moment in the fight for justice, while others dismissed it as a distraction from larger issues. Angela tried to block out the noise, focusing on the facts and the law, but she couldn't ignore the pressure, the sense that this case was about more than just her and Harding. The story was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. Angela and Harding were on a collision course, their lives intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. And as the courtroom drama unfolded, one question loomed large: would justice prevail, or would the system once again fail those it was meant to protect? The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that buzzed with unspoken words and anxious energy. Everyone could feel it. The case was reaching a boiling point, and the stakes had never been higher. Angela sat on the bench, her face calm but her mind racing. Every decision she made from this point forward would echo far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The pressure was immense, but Angela had spent her life preparing for moments like this. She reminded herself of the promise she made years ago, to always uphold the law with integrity, no matter how personal the case. Officer Harding sat at the defendant's table, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His lawyer was leaning close, whispering a strategy that Harding barely heard. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the weight of everything that had surfaced during the hearing. The witness testimonies, the evidence, the public scrutiny. It was all crashing down on him. For the first time in his career, he felt exposed, vulnerable. He had always believed he was in control, but now sitting in a courtroom where the roles had flipped, he realized how fragile that control truly was. Rachel Perez, the journalist whose articles had fueled much of the public outcry, sat in the gallery, her notepad balanced on her knee. She watched Harding carefully, taking in every expression, every gesture. Rachel had spent years uncovering stories like this, stories of power, bias, and the fight for accountability. But something about this case felt different. It wasn't just about Harding or Angela. It was about the larger story it told, about the cracks in a system that had long been in need of repair. Outside the courthouse, the protests had swelled to unprecedented numbers. The streets were filled with people holding signs and chanting for justice. Some were there to support Angela, seeing her as a symbol of resilience and fairness. Others rallied against what they perceived as an attack on law enforcement, arguing that Harding was being unfairly targeted. The tension between the two groups was palpable, and officers had been stationed to maintain order. The courthouse steps had become a microcosm of the broader societal divide, a battle of ideals playing out in real time. Inside, the hearing reached a critical moment as the final piece of evidence was presented. Rachel's investigation had uncovered internal memos from the police department, documents that detailed complaints against Harding that had been quietly dismissed. Angela read the memos carefully, her expression unreadable. The documents painted a damning picture of a system that had enabled Harding's behavior, prioritizing loyalty over accountability. The courtroom buzzed as the memos were entered into evidence, the weight of their contents sinking in. Harding shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Angela addressed the courtroom, her voice steady but firm. These memos raise serious concerns about systemic failures within the department. They suggest a culture where misconduct is tolerated rather than addressed. This is not just about Officer Harding. This is about ensuring that no one is above the law, regardless of their position. Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Harding's lawyer stood to argue, his voice tinged with desperation. He claimed the memos were irrelevant to the specific incident, an attempt to distract from the facts of the case. But Angela wasn't swayed. She could see through the deflection, her years on the bench giving her an acute sense of when someone was trying to manipulate the narrative. As the day stretched on, the tension in the room grew thick. Angela called for a recess, giving everyone a chance to regroup. Harding stepped outside into the hallway, his jaw clenched as he avoided the stares of reporters and onlookers. He could feel the walls closing in, the realization creeping in that this was no longer a fight he could win with bravado or denial. For the first time, he began to question everything, the choices he had made, the beliefs he had clung to, the man he had become. Angela remained in her chambers, her hands resting on the file that contained the case's most critical pieces of evidence. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside her. This wasn't just about doing her job, it was about setting a precedent, about showing that even those who wield power must answer for their actions. She thought about her parents, about the sacrifices they had made to give her a chance at a better life. She thought about the young people who might see her on that bench and feel inspired to fight for justice in their own ways. When the hearing resumed, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The final arguments were made, each side presenting their case with a fervor that reflected the stakes. Harding's lawyer painted him as a dedicated officer who had been caught in an unfortunate situation, while the prosecution highlighted the pattern of behavior that had been laid bare. Angela listened intently, her expression giving nothing away. As the arguments concluded, Angela addressed the courtroom. This case is about more than one individual. It is about the principles of justice, accountability, and fairness. It is about ensuring that our institutions serve the people they are meant to protect. I will take all the evidence into consideration before delivering my decision. The room fell silent as Angela rose, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. Harding watched her leave, a mix of fear and resignation in his eyes. He knew the decision was out of his hands now, and the weight of that realization was crushing. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger, the energy reaching a fever pitch. The chants for justice echoed through the streets, a chorus of voices demanding change. Angela stepped out of the courthouse, flanked by security, and felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. This case wasn't just about her. It was about the countless stories of injustice that had come before it and the hope for a better future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the courthouse stood as a beacon of both conflict and possibility. The climax was near, and everyone, Angela, Harding, and the community at large, was bracing for what would come next.